Yeah. Okay. So hi, I'm Jacy. It's great to be here. Really big thanks to David for orchestrating all this stuff this week. I know that's crazy. I mostly work in social science and machine learning. So I'm excited to present work that is entirely philosophical. There's no science or math in it, but I'm going to try to present it in a way that doesn't require understanding of the philosophical knowledge or jargon involved. So specifically, I'm going to develop and defend a view called consciousness semanticism, which is a claim that consciousness doesn't exist in the way implied by common sense, because we're really confused about its semantics. I'd consider it a flavor or a type of consciousness eliminativism or reductionism or anti-realism or illusionism. There are lots of similar terms bounced around. You can also read it as a claim that against the hard problem of consciousness, that problem doesn't exist. Or more concretely for this conference, the presentation is about when should we say that a machine is conscious? And this work isn't published yet, but I think it's almost ready. So feedback is very, very welcome. Okay. So I'm building on this long literature on the philosophy of consciousness, which has existed for so long and so vehemently, perhaps because it's so intrinsic to our daily existence. You know, everyone has a very strong opinion on what consciousness is and is not. Chalmers in 1995 posed this so-called hard problem that even if we came up with a deep understanding of brain processes through neuroscience and other strategies, there's still an apparently insurmountable problem of understanding what Chalmers sees as first-person experience, or this common notion of qualia or phenomenal consciousness. That seems to be on the other side of a sort of impossible gap from more everyday understanding of the mind. Much of the philosophical literature since 1995, I would claim it has been basically a direct response to Chalmers, and this has really set the agenda for the field. I think it's been somewhat of a capitulation, in fact. Immediately after this, there was a special issue in the Journal of Consciousness Studies, of course, on the hard problem in 1996, which really cemented its centrality. Dennett, since that day and before that and to today, has been the most well-known critic of this notion of the hard problem. That same year, Paul and Patricia Churchland tried to rebut it. I believe Paul talked about the rediscovery of light and made that comparison. Patricia Churchland famously wrote the Hornswoggle problem instead of the hard problem. The debate continues to this day under many different names. Frankish's illusionism is particularly well known and hot right now. Strawson and Dennett had a bit of a brouhaha in the New York Review of Books, where Strawson said that eliminativism is the silliest claim ever made. The arguments here have, I think, consisted almost entirely of intuition and analogy. So just comparing consciousness to something like life and elan vital, or cuteness and heat, and sort of jousting their intuitions against each other in a way that has seemed somewhat unproductive. At least there's very few, if any, examples of people changing sides based on the sort of arguments people have thrown out. So this usually takes the form of someone like Dennett will throw out a comparison and say like, hey, there's obviously not a hard problem of life or cuteness or heat. And then Chalmers responds that qualia cries out for explanation in a way that these other things don't. And the intuitions are kind of left there on the ground and we don't get further along. I think to some extent, we can bypass this. This might be what people in this conference are more interested in, just going straight to the operationalization, sort of straight to the positivist neuroscience, something like integrated information theory or global workspace theory, or all sorts of claims we can make about consciousness in the mind. But I think the foundational question still matters, at least to some extent. It's worth working on as part of our portfolio. I'll speak more about the implications at the end, but I think neuroscientists and particularly philosophers have sort of wasted a lot of time and ink trying to reach this reality, this ineffability, this something on the other side of the impassable hard problem gap. I think it's sort of been wasted effort, and we can be more practical. We can be more clear and concrete. That's sort of the view I'll argue for. I think there are just certain features of consciousness or something like self-report, of conscious experience in human subjects that we can correlate really well with. And that's a sense in which something like integrated information theory might turn out to be, correct in a way. We should understand that that's just mapping onto a specific measurable phenomenon. There's not going to be a right answer to which one of these is the correct theory of consciousness itself. And that's sort of what I'll argue in the rest of this presentation. So My approach is moving past the intuition and analogy and trying to lay out some sort of logical, precise argument, which comes with its own challenges, as you'll see, but I think can escape the morass of clunky argumentation. I think this can be, uncomfortable. We have to precisely define terms that we want to treat vaguely, like consciousness, or what does it mean for something to exist? And I think that's always going to feel wrong. There's never going to be a definition that perfectly maps onto our intuition. Otherwise, we'd already be there. And we have to sort of smooth out the scatter plot of intuition to some extent. I also think definitions are arbitrary. This is sort of an epistemological assumption I'm coming into it with. The map is not the territory, as they say. But you can buy all my empirics and logic and arguments with different definitions, and that's fine if you don't want to call yourself an eliminativist. As long as you buy the substance, I think you get the concrete implementations. So I'm arguing for a flavor of this view called eliminativism, or eliminative materialism, though that sort of conflates it with materialism. It's the claim that our ordinary common sense understanding of the mind is deeply wrong, and that some or all of the mental states posited by common sense do not actually exist and have no role to play in a mature science of the mind. So this can apply to any mental state. Particularly popular is arguing that beliefs don't exist, by like the Churchlands think. But consciousness eliminativism per se is that consciousness does not exist in this way that common sense suggests. And semanticism, which is my contribution to this literature, is a flavor of eliminativism grounded in, again, a logical, precise argument around the inconsistent semantics of consciousness, and both everyday and kind of common sense understanding, as this definition alludes to, but also in the scholarly discourse itself. So the first kind of semantic challenge we have to tackle here is, what does it mean for a property to not exist? I think that the definition of property has somewhat of a consensus in the literature. It's widely shared in the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, for example, that it's entities that can be predicated of things. So consciousness is the property in the sense that it is predicated of, perhaps adult able-bodied humans, but not other entities in the universe, perhaps trees or rocks, for example. There's no consensus, however, and it's much more challenging to come up with something for exist. So I have to sort of venture my own definitions, and that's a big part of this paper, based on some, hopefully reasonable criteria for definitions like simplicity, precision, and approximation of the usage of the word in everyday language. I think we should treat it as potential discoverability. So this means that a property exists if and only if, given all relevant knowledge and power, we could categorize all entities in terms of whether and to what extent, if any, they possess that property of interest. So if I give you, a world of lines on paper, I can give you a precise property, a property that does exist, like triangles being, a closed series of lines that only consists of, 3 straight lines, or a square being 4 equal sides with right angles or something like that. But if I give you a more ostensive, Wittgenstein definition of, well, it's shapes like this one, or it's shapes that look cool, that's not a property that exists within that, small space. And I think that's the most meaningful way to smooth out the scatter plot of our intuitions on here. Obviously, there are edge cases and corner cases that aren't well defined. So incomputably large numbers, think of notation and 3 to the power of 3, and so on, where you don't have enough atoms in the universe to sort of compute it. Then, maybe we'll never make progress, even if we had all relevant knowledge and power, omniscience, omnipotence. That might seem like something that still exists, even though it's not potentially discoverable. I don't think that anyone's really claiming that sort of thing for consciousness, so we can largely bypass it. But in general, I think we just need to put forth these kind of specific definitions, and make our claims on those terms to avoid what Chalmers himself calls verbal disputes, where people, if they shared the same verbiage, the same definitions, then they would come to agreement. So it's solely rhetorical, verbal dispute. Again, the map is not the territory. So here's the argument. And at this point, you may see where I'm going. There are a lot of common definitions of consciousness, like most famously Thomas Nagel and what it's like to be a bat or another entity, or Strawson's reference to jazz. If you gotta ask, you ain't never gonna get to know. Then there's a usage of consciousness that's also commonplace, referring to whether entities have it. Like, is this machine conscious, or how likely is it that insects are conscious? So I'm considering these as kind of the standard definition, the standard usage of the term. Notice on one hand that each common definition of consciousness is imprecise. On the other, the standard usage implies precision. Therefore, that's inconsistent. And take the definition of existence of a property that we just gave. Therefore, consciousness does not exist in this sense. So that's the sort of semanticist and by extension, illuminativist view. Obviously, it can feel weird to lay it all precisely. There are many things that you could contest that don't jibe with your own definitions. We're used to grand gestures and sort of vague, ostensive references to consciousness. But I think this is what we need in the field. In exactly what way does consciousness exist or not exist? In exactly what way can we discover the nature of consciousness? And in exactly what way do we need instead to just subjectively assemble neuroscientific and other models about the mind and sort of define consciousness as we go. So I'm hesitant to, of course, evoke an analogy because I'm saying that we need this sort of argumentation instead of broad analogies as argumentation. But for purely illustrative purposes, I like to consider the example of stars, or in early human history, just the lights in the sky. When the proto-scientific notion, of stardom or starness was incomplete, inchoate. As we research, those lights in the sky with telescopes and other tools, we changed the definition as we went to a star being balls of plasma, and then planets, for example, being and asteroids and whatnot being balls of rock. And that was a sort of persistification that we've gotten in all of science at large. Life has went to being, well, let's study this particular quality. Instead of asking, is a virus alive? We just say, in what sense does a virus reproduce? And then we sort of go straight to the substance of the situation. And I think that's the same sort of thing, again, that this implies for consciousness, that we won't be able to discover it in the way that many people treat it as. We just need to focus on, again, those more concrete properties, like does this entity have reinforcement learning, or does it have integration, and make those part of our definition if we think that's the most useful rhetorical or semantic strategy. So I also want to discuss, some of the most common sort of objections to this that I've gotten as I've been discussing the work with various philosophers. So the main one, of course, is being that this is just a matter of inference, saying that I'm conscious. I know that I've direct observation of it. So by analogy, this is a good general way to argue and know things in the universe. Others probably are too. I think this argument by analogy still requires precision. It applies to cases where there's empirical uncertainty. So if I know nothing about the stock market, but then somebody proposes two different strategies for buying stocks, and one of them is really simple and the other's not, maybe I want to use a sort of analogy and look at all the examples in my life where simpler strategies have worked better, in different contexts, and then apply it here. I don't think it applies in cases where we have this sort of vagueness or logical problem at play. That isn't an empirical issue. It's not amenable to the tools of probability theory or something. Of course, you could more directly say that you have direct, irrefutable evidence of your own consciousness, and therefore my claims that it doesn't exist are obviously false. I can put forth any sort of fancy wordplay and sleight of hand with logical argumentation, but that can't refute the thing that you would know, even if you were a brain in a vat. You would still be observing your own conscious experience directly. I think you can define consciousness in this way, define consciousness as the observation itself, the thing that you can't deny, even if you're a brain in a vat. But again, I'm taking issue with the questions like, is this machine conscious? This is not a question about what's going on in your individual head, the thing that you could define consciousness from, but instead a potentially discoverable property that extends across entities. So I think this is just kind of conflating two different senses of the word consciousness. And I think this has been maybe the main mistake in the literature so far, is that someone like Strawson will say the eliminativism is the silliest claim ever made, because he's referring to consciousness as that observation, that undeniable thing. And someone like Daniel Dennett is instead referring to it as a property, as something larger than that you don't get sort of for free, or at least isn't irrefutable. So you could go to, again, the different cases where you could have hard problems, or you could have existence or non-existence. So other properties like life and brightness, etc. Does this argument mean that because precisely that they don't exist. Life, we can kind of gesture at reproduction and a few other things, mortality maybe, but that doesn't allow us to clearly categorize all entities in the universe as alive or not alive. I think this is actually true, and I totally bite the bullet on this one. I think that this is a really important realization about our language, and I think it's obvious in most cases that we should not set up research agendas around, is my raincoat bright, or does GPT-3 have elan vital? Is GPT-3 alive? Or is a candle bright? Or is Mount Davidson a mountain? That's a mountain that's just around the sort of 300 meters range I think people put forward for mountainhood. I would apply exactly the same critique if people were building research agendas and sort of wasting time on these questions as philosophers of mind do. I think we can just be reductionists here, and we can just sweep away these sorts of questions. And that's the obvious choice in these cases. I think we just get really confused about consciousness because of our intimate experience with it. And then you can, of course, say that you don't like the definitions that I put forth. You think that this definition of existence doesn't fit the intuitions we have, or it isn't the right one, or maybe it's a primitive and we can't even define it in this sort of way, and you just kind of have a brute insistence on that. I think that's fine. The empirical upshots, which I'll discuss on the next slide, remain, even if you label this non-eliminativism. I also think that, if you just want to force things to be primitives or brutally insist that you're correct on any philosophical question, that kind of cuts off the discourse at the head. There's nothing more we can accomplish. And maybe that's just the case, but there's not really much more to say on that topic, whether this is consciousness or free will or intelligence or any other philosophical issue. Okay, so why does this matter? Why does all this bothering about vocabulary and definitions make a difference? Well, the main thing is just this sort of waste of time issue. And I think there's a ton of confusion. There's a whole quagmire that you now have to wade through if you want to contribute to sort of the philosophy of consciousness literature, is a waste of everyone's time, really. I think the hard problem has sort of derailed us. I see the motivation for it. I think it was an interesting idea to put forth, but I think we should stop being so tied to it as a field. There are certainly useful measures of what's going on inside someone's mind, cognitive architectures, and one theory of consciousness or theory of cognitive architectures might best fit with certain criteria. One might just literally correlate the best with human self-report of consciousness under an fMRI scanner or something, but none will turn out to be correct in any objective sense. I also think that if you're considering, moral value, or considering all the different entities in the universe, should we care more about animals? Which artificial intelligences or robots should have rights? Then the correlations between perceived consciousness and various features, like neuroanatomy or history, are less weighty evidence of consciousness for an eliminativist. Again, eliminativism or reductionism allows us to sort of peer directly at, okay, what processes are happening here, what matters to us, and we don't have to rely so much on these vague, neural correlates of consciousness or something like that. Those still matter for our scientific enterprise, but they matter relatively less if you think we can instead peer directly into what consciousness is, and it's not on the other side of this sort of hard problem, ineffable gap. Direct measures of processes. So if we care about nociception, just avoiding sort of bad outcomes, which is quite widely spread across, the animal kingdom, for example, those things matter more. And I think in general, this should make us sort of care more about small and weird minds, whether biological or artificial or otherwise. Finally, if we're just estimating sort of the future of the field of artificial intelligence or humanity's trajectory writ large, we shouldn't expect scientific convergence on which entities are conscious or sentient, or probably not even on which ones are morally relevant. I think this is concerning in a way. We're not going to discover facts of the matter that keep us from, causing lots of suffering in the world. Taking some robots and enslaving them by other robots or something like that. I think this makes those sort of dystopias a little more likely and a little more worrisome. And we shouldn't expect convergence. And to be clear here, I don't mean to say that all consciousness, realists think that scientific convergence will happen. Again, if consciousness is on the other side of this ineffable gap, we might not be able to access that. But certainly a large branch of sort of realist thought involves some accessibility of that, even if that's just really good correlations or with verbal self-report or something. And I think we should in general update away from those and be more worried about the distant future. So I know that was quick, but thank you all for listening, and I'm happy to take any comments or questions.
So, someone is texting me. Mark, are you on? I'll ping you in a second. So, Jace, so you're saying that we shouldn't be researching cognitive architectures, or just that we shouldn't try to figure out which one is right?
Just that we shouldn't try to figure out which one is right.
Because, I mean, if we're going to build an AGI, we've got to have some kind of cognitive architecture.
Yeah, modeling is useful. I think a lot of the field has gotten a bit derailed, more so philosophy than the neuroscientists or computer scientists. But we should avoid going down the rabbit hole of which one is correct, or even which one maps on the best to like human consciousness in particular, and think more generally and materially.
Shouldn't we be trying? So my concern is, I would think we would try to model human consciousness as the best model for machine consciousness, or at least, given that it's a working model, that's the shortest distance to success. Would that not be the case? Or
I think that's a big debate, and it's like this doesn't have direct implications for it.
Okay, so you're not saying that we shouldn't try to model. I mean, because basically to do that, we need to figure out how consciousness works in the human mind. And you're saying shouldn't try to do that?
It depends on exactly what we're trying to figure out within the human mind. And I mean, to be clear, I think there's like an empirical hard question about like what's most likely route to AGI or something. Many smart people, think that it's not through mimicry per se. I mean, there are, of course, a wide spectrum. There's something like neural networks that are vaguely inspired, but of course, have a lot of freedom on their own. I think that it's that we shouldn't try to treat human consciousness per se as something that we need to drive towards. So instead, something like, well, hey, which cognitive architectures correlate with, somebody in an fMRI scanner saying that they're, experiencing a lot of conscious experience or a little or none at all, what maps onto anesthesia and other, pain asymbolia could be really interesting. But we should just take those all as specific measures rather than as indications of some deep theory.
So many people, Giulio Tononi and others, believe that consciousness is necessary for learning. I mean, you look at Bernard Barr's model, and fundamentally, consciousness serves to learn, and it also serves for anomaly handling. And arguably, by many true experts in the computer science field, they believe that the only way that you're going to get strong AGI is via consciousness.
Yeah, I mean, my question there would just be what exactly is meant by consciousness there. And if it's something like reinforcement, that's one thing. If it's some ineffable property, then I'm not convinced that it's like materially important in that way.
So a lot of it is that, have you read, for example, Linnaeus, or have you read Metzinger, or have you read anything about Graziano's work, the attention schema, and all those? All of those cover heavily why consciousness is very, very likely necessary for AGI, why it's a component that without that, you're just, doing automated processes.
Yeah, I mean, if it's attention schema or global workspace or something, then there's like a specific operationalization, which is like we bring things onto a theater of the mind and are able to pay attention to them and like better integrate them into other things and focus on them, et cetera, et cetera. And that's a very different sense than qualio or phenomenal experience. And you can argue that that is important, some sort of spotlight of the mind. And that's valuable, but it's not the sort of consciousness that philosophers of mind focus on.
Again, I would strongly suggest reading Metzinger.
Yeah, I've read quite a bit.
And so is there, or I guess the question is, how do you react to the argument that consciousness is merely a process that runs against a simulation that's created by a lower level set of mental processes?
I think simulation processes are important in the mind. It's unclear how important they are. And like if you get all the way into higher order theories of consciousness, how much does that actually map onto what's going on in the mind? But I think that can be useful. And again, it's not invoking the more ephemeral, ineffable sense of consciousness.
Well, there really is no ephemeral, ineffable sense of consciousness. I mean, you've got a deep divide on the hard problem, or so-called hard problem of consciousness. People who believe that consciousness is just, a process running on what the lower levels of the mind feed it. I mean, fundamentally, a qualia is something passed by the lower levels of the mind. It explains illusions. It explains why you feel, quote unquote, feel what you feel is just because you're told that you feel it. And qualia can become very complex because a mind attaches a lot of its own stuff and sensations and the like to the raw qualia. And the whole argument about Mary, even the person who came up with it, Mary not experiencing the color red, but learning something new by doing so, the whole argument is that a brain isn't large enough to simulate itself. So it sort of seems like there aren't any mystical questions left if you just look at it in an engineering sense.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds like you're an illuminativist, and that's great if you don't think there are such mystical questions.
Do you believe in dualism?
Dualism is somewhat separate. You can still be a reductionist and illuminativist if you think that the thing that consciousness reduces or eliminates to is something like property dualism. I think there's a strong correlation towards materialism. I don't think it's, I think it's orthogonal to this.
I mean, also what I'm arguing though is that consciousness is a process. It's not a material, but it's something that material objects perform. And then that's about as much dualism as you get.
Yeah, and I would say that the question of whether it's a material or a process doesn't have a correct answer. It's interesting to see what practical phenomena correlate to materials and to processes. And I suspect that most of what everyday language refers to as consciousness maps onto processes. That's just my own personal suspicion. But that's the sort of question that I don't want to at least belabor.
I'm just sort of curious because you seem very negative, and I guess I'm not sure if it's because of the fact that you're concerned about the dangers or the fact that it's a rabbit hole, or what. Some of my reactions to each of those are, it's more dangerous not to have AGI than to have AGI. And I think it's not a rabbit hole because I think it's a necessary part.
Yeah, I don't think that's a rabbit hole either.
Cool.
I think we might have other questions or comments.
Had a question.
Yeah, I think it was Dennett, and he was talking about the related symbol grounding problem and the problem of meaning. And if you have solved that, from there, consciousness is quite reachable, quite easily reachable. And he came up with a definition of a system that he said in pondering whether such a thing might exist at all. So he came up with a definition of a system that, or characterization is maybe a better term, that would satisfy many of the different characterizations. And he described it as some sort of logical semantic property, pretty strange logical semantic property of formula or language, of thoughts. Would you find that satisfying?
Yeah, I'm not sure I have much to say on that. Again, this isn't to say that one cognitive architecture is more likely to map onto phenomena we associate with consciousness than others. I think that's an open question. Other people on this call are more of an expert on it than I am. I think it's to say
I'm not talking
that's
about the system, but about what it is. So you were talking about definitions, and that you find it, there is no one definition. And now we talked about processes. This is another perspective, a logical semantic property. Would you find that satisfying?
Yeah, so that definition, I think where I said consciousness is what it's like to be something, or the dyactic or ostensive definition of the thing between the redness of red, the smell of a mushroom, etc., the connection between all these qualia, just referring to examples. You could also put in there some specific theory of consciousness, like integrated information theory or Dinnett's or attention schema or what have you. I think the issue there is just like most people in the field are not going to be a fan of your particular definition of consciousness. They're going to say that's not pointing to the thing that I really see as consciousness, especially someone like Chalmers, who I think is very skeptical that any of these will be able to map on to the sort of ineffable qualia that he's interested in. So I wouldn't find it satisfying.
Yeah, but it is semantics he's talking about, isn't it? Like real world semantics. That's his point. That's Chalmers' point. I think then it was trying to address that. So there would have to be this kind of qualia property of in logical semantics, something like that.
Interesting. Yeah, I'll have to think more about that.